there is a unique and primal terror that comes from being stalked. It's a fear that dismantles your world piece by piece. It begins with small, unsettling events you try to dismiss. A strange message from an unknown number. A person on the trail behind you who perfectly mirrors your pace. A social media profile that has stolen your life and adds pictures you've never seen. Tonight's tales are about that slow, creeping dread. We will follow 6 people whose lives are invaded by an unseen observer. An observer who is about to step out of the shadows. From a stalker who leaves a photo taken from an impossible angle, to one that follows you from the mall all the way to your front door. So get comfortable, turn down the lights, and let's begin. It's strange, the things you miss about a life that's gone, and how a memory that should be peaceful can get so thoroughly poisoned by what came after. I used to find this sense of peace in my old routine, a kind of quiet stability that I thought I could build my life on. It was a conscious choice, a framework I built to keep the chaos of the world at arm's length. Looking back now, I can see how that same stability was really just a cage waiting to be locked, its bars made of my own predictable habits. For 3 years, that pattern was my whole world. The jarring sound of the 6:15 a.m. alarm, followed by the quiet comfort of that same 6-block walk through Capitol Hill as the city was waking up. I can still remember the smell of the damp pavement and the promise of a warm caramel latte from Victrola Coffee Roasters before I descend underground for the familiar rumble of the Link light rail from Westlake Station to my job in downtown Seattle, Washington. I lived alone in a little studio in First Hill, a neighborhood right in the heart of the city, and I thought that made me safe. What I didn't understand then was that my quiet, solitary life wasn't a fortress. It was just an observation deck with a single, perfect view for anyone who cared to watch. That particular May, the city was finally shaking off the last of the winter chill, with the air turning fresh and the trees along Broadway Avenue full of bright, new green leaves. The familiar Seattle scent of rain on pavement was always mingling with the smell of brewing coffee, a smell that used to feel like home. But the changing of the seasons never once disrupted my personal ecosystem. As I still walked the same route and caught the same 7:40 a.m. train, my apartment was my sanctuary, the one space in the world that I felt I had complete control over. I had this little souvenir I'd bought when I first moved here, a small, heavy model of the Space Needle. I kept it on my windowsill, and every morning before I left, I had this dumb little ritual of making sure it was facing perfectly outward, looking over the city. It was a small, meaningless detail in a life full of them, a quiet anchor in my day, and I never imagined it could be turned into a weapon against me. The first time something breached my carefully constructed world, it was almost too subtle to even notice. I came home from work one evening and found a small, folded piece of paper stuck in my doorframe. The handwriting was a tidy, anonymous script that simply read, "Hope you had a good caramel latte this morning." I pulled it from the door and stared at it for a moment, a flicker of confusion passing through me before I dismissed it. I figured it was a mistake, maybe a note meant for a neighbor that got put in the wrong door, a simple, logical explanation. I tossed it in the trash without a second thought and had completely forgotten about it by the next morning. But a few days later, another one appeared in the exact same spot. This one said, "Saw you took the train a little later today. Switching it up?" A cold string was plucked somewhere deep in my gut, but I again tried to rationalize it. I told myself it was probably a friend from work playing a stupid prank, someone who knew my schedule and thought this was hilarious. After that second note, they became a quiet fixture in my life, appearing every couple of days without fail. It was never anything overtly threatening on the surface, but the observations started to get closer, more specific, commenting on the green jacket I wore all the time, or the title of the book I was reading on the train. It was this slow, creeping realization that someone was paying attention to the tiny, mundane details that nobody should ever notice. That early confusion I felt started to curdle into this low-grade anxiety, a constant hum of dread that followed me everywhere. My whole perception of the city began to change, as the crowds at the train station were no longer anonymous, but were instead a sea of potential faces I felt compelled to scan. I found myself checking my reflection in the dark glass of storefront windows as I walked home, my eyes searching for anyone who might be lingering too long behind me in the moving collage of strangers. But there was never anyone there. Never a single person out of place. And that somehow made the feeling so much worse. It made the threat feel invisible and all-seeing. And I honestly started to wonder if I was losing my mind, just manufacturing a phantom out of my own growing fear. I remember one evening, just after getting inside my apartment, I was hit with this overwhelming feeling of being watched, so strong that I physically froze with my hand still on the doorknob. The familiar comfort of my home was gone, replaced by a tense, alien stillness that made the air feel thick in my lungs. I quickly checked the peephole, but the hallway was completely empty, just as it always was. Still, the muscles in my back coiled tight as I double-checked the deadbolt and the chain lock, my own quiet space no longer feeling like a refuge. A few nights after that, I deliberately decided to break my routine in a major way, hoping to throw off whoever was doing this. I stayed at the office until well after 8 o'clock, long past my usual departure time, telling absolutely no one that I was working late. When I finally got home, the sight of another folded note resting on my doormat made my stomach clench. I picked it up with a trembling hand, my breath catching in my throat as I read the 6 simple words scribbled inside. Late night. Thought you might do that. That was the exact moment the floor fell out from under me. The fragile bubble of denial I had been living in completely shattered, and the chilling reality of my situation crashed down on me. This wasn't a prank by a friend or a simple misunderstanding. I was being stalked by someone who wasn't just observing my patterns, but was actively anticipating my attempts to break them. My meticulously structured life, the very thing that had always given me a sense of security and control, now felt like a cage that I had built for myself. My predictability had made me an easy target, and my stalker was now playing a game with me, a game where they were always one step ahead. After that night, I abandoned my routine entirely, driven by a desperate need to become unpredictable. I started taking convoluted routes home from the office, walking through neighborhoods I didn't know. I stopped going to Victrola, instead getting my coffee from random, soulless chain shops far from my usual path. I varied my commute times wildly, sometimes leaving for work at the crack of dawn, and other times waiting until the morning rush had completely died down. Of course, none of it made a damn bit of difference in the end. The notes, they just kept coming, always there waiting for me on my doorstep or wedged into the doorframe, a constant and terrifying reminder that I couldn't escape. The messages had taken on a new, mocking tone that made my skin crawl. Nice detour today. Didn't think you'd like that coffee shop. Or, saw you skip the train this morning. Walking suits you. My stalker was not only tracking me, but was responding to my frantic efforts to get away. And it felt like they were enjoying my fear. My world began to shrink until it was just me and the suffocating presence of my invisible observer. I grew deeply suspicious of everyone around me. The quiet guy down the hall, the person standing a little too close on the train platform, the stranger walking behind me for more than a block. Paranoia became my default state, and I started taking the stairs up to my fourth-floor apartment instead of the elevator, my heart pounding with every flight. And then, after weeks of this psychological game, the whole thing escalated into something that I still can't really explain. I woke one morning to find a small, plain white envelope that had been slipped under my door overnight. My fingers felt numb as I picked it up and tore it open, revealing a single photograph inside. It was a picture of me, sitting on my couch and reading a book, taken from outside my apartment window the night before. I lived on the fourth floor of my building, and my window faced a narrow back alley with no balcony, no ledge, no fire escape, and not even a window on that side of the building. There was no physical way for someone to have taken that photo from that angle. I spent the entire day in a state of shock, my mind trying to rationalize it. A drone, a cleverly doctored image, anything to avoid the chilling implication that this person wasn't bound by the same rules of reality as me. I felt like I was losing my grip, teetering on the edge of a complete breakdown. Then, that evening, I came home late from a deliberately erratic trip to the grocery store, my nerves completely shredded, and that's when the final and most terrifying violation happened. I found my front door slightly ajar, not completely closed. I was absolutely positive that I had locked it that morning, as I had checked the deadbolt twice before leaving. My hands went cold as I slowly pushed the door open, my mind racing with the horrifying knowledge of who had been there. I stepped inside to find that everything looked perfectly normal, with nothing stolen or even out of place. There was no sign of a break-in. Yet I was overcome with a profound and visceral certainty that someone had been inside my home. A deep chill worked its way into my bones as I methodically checked every room, my eyes darting into every corner. The apartment was empty, but the air itself felt violated and wrong. As I stood in the living room, trying to calm my frantic breathing, my gaze drifted to the windowsill. My heart stopped. The little Space Needle souvenir was still there, but it had been turned around. Instead of facing out toward the city as I always left it, it was now facing inward, watching me. Sleep wasn't really an option that night, with the tangible proof that my stalker had breached my home, my most private space, and had touched my things just to mess with me. This was the final, horrifying confirmation I needed. This person wasn't just watching from impossible angles. They could walk through my front door whenever they pleased. I knew right then that I had to leave immediately, without a moment's hesitation. I frantically threw a few essential items into a backpack and left my apartment without looking back, terrified of what might happen when night fell. I checked into a cheap, anonymous hotel several miles away, bolting every lock on the door before collapsing onto the bed. I considered calling the police, but I knew how stalking cases were often handled without a clear suspect, frequently dismissed until it was too late. I wasn't going to wait around for that to happen. By the next morning, my only thought was that I needed some kind of proof, something tangible to show someone, even if I didn't go to the police right away. I went back, not to my apartment, but to my landlord and pleaded with him to check the building's security cameras from the last few nights. It took some convincing, but he eventually pulled up the grainy footage from the camera in my fourth-floor hallway, specifically from the night the photo had been delivered. What we saw on the screen sent a wave of nausea through me. The video showed a figure dressed in a black hoodie with the hood pulled up and a balaclava mask covering their face, so their features were completely obscured. The figure moved with a slow, deliberate confidence as they knelt down and carefully slipped the envelope under my door. They never hesitated or looked around nervously, acting as if they owned the place. The landlord checked the lobby cameras and found no record of the person ever entering or leaving through the main doors. He wasn't a tenant, and he had somehow gotten inside the supposedly secure building and all the way up to my floor, completely undetected. That's it. I had to get out of Seattle for good. Within a day, I had packed a single bag, booked a one-way flight to stay with a friend across the country, and told my landlord I was breaking my lease. I never went back to that apartment again. Even now, years later in a new city, I am haunted by the ghost of that experience. I always check the hallways before I step inside my home, and I constantly watch the reflections in store windows when I walk. And I never, ever make the mistake of assuming that I am truly alone. You know, it's funny how a normal, everyday habit can turn into something you're afraid of. For me, it was my phone. I'm one of those people who probably spends a clinically significant amount of time scrolling, a fact I've always been aware of, but never really cared to change. That nightly ritual of flipping through Instagram before bed had become second nature. Just a mindless, easy habit to help my brain power down. I never thought something so simple could curdle into the stuff of nightmares. This all started last year, after I made the decision to move up to Vancouver, needing a serious change of scenery after quitting my job in the States. My older brother had been reassigned overseas for work, leaving his recently purchased house completely empty. And he offered to let me stay there, rent-free for a while. The house was in a quiet, sleepy suburb, the kind of place where people give a friendly wave as they drive by but never really get into each other's business. A stillness that felt peaceful at first, but eventually took on a more hollow tone. The arrangement was only supposed to be temporary, just a quiet place for me to reset and get my bearings. My brother had owned the house for a couple of years, but had never truly settled in, as his company had him traveling almost constantly. He had barely spent more than a handful of nights there himself, leaving the place fully furnished, but feeling more like a sterile Airbnb than an actual home. It had sat empty for months before I arrived, and you could feel that deep, settled vacancy in its walls, a silence that seemed to swallow up any sound I made. The isolation was fine at first, even a little welcome after the chaos of my old job. I established a new routine for myself, working remotely from the spare bedroom, getting coffee from the same local spot every morning, and going for long runs in a nearby park. Thinking back on it now, there was one small thing that seemed off a few weeks before everything started. I remember coming home one afternoon to find the gate to the backyard was slightly ajar, and I just assumed the wind had blown it open, or maybe a neighbor's dog had nudged it. I closed it, latched it, and didn't give it another thought. I guess that one night in April started out like any other. I had finished up with work for the day, grabbed my usual latte, and had even posted a quick picture of it to my Instagram story, like the creature of habit I am. Later that evening, I was curled up on the living room couch with Netflix on, half watching some show while mindlessly thumbing through my phone, when something made me stop cold. An account that I didn't recognize had just liked one of my older photos. The username was bizarrely similar to my own handle, almost identical but with an extra underscore at the end. That alone wouldn't have been enough to get my attention. But what made my pause was the account's profile picture. The picture was of me. I clicked on the profile with a sense of confused curiosity, expecting to find some kind of spam bot or a weird fan account. But what I discovered made my skin crawl. The entire account was an exact, perfect replica of my own profile, featuring the same posts, the same captions, and the same photos in the exact same order. But as I scrolled further down the feed, a knot of ice began to form in my gut. Some of the pictures on this duplicate account were not mine. To be more precise, they were definitely pictures of me. But they were photos that I had never taken or posted anywhere online. There was a candid shot of me walking into the coffee shop from earlier that week, and another photo of me sitting on a park bench from a few weeks ago, looking down at my phone. And then I saw a picture of me through the living room window of my brother's house. A photo that could have only been taken from the street outside. A deep, unsettling chill crept through my body as I realized that all of these pictures were recent, some of them taken just days ago. I frantically checked the account's bio for any information, but there was nothing there. Just a copy-pasted version of my own profile description. I scrolled through its follower list, finding only a handful of blank, newly created accounts that offered no clues whatsoever. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was probably some sophisticated AI-generated scam account that scraped content. But the uniqueness of the photos, the specific angles and private locations, told a different story. I immediately reported the account for impersonation, and Instagram's automated response popped up, confirming that my report had been received. I closed the app and tried to put it out of my mind. Sleep didn't really come that night, and the first thing I did the next morning was open Instagram, my fingers feeling tense as I refreshed my notifications. The duplicate account was still there, and it was still active. But something had changed that made my stomach tighten into a hard knot of fear. The account was now following me. I stared at my phone in disbelief, my mind racing to find a logical explanation for why it hadn't been taken down. I tried to ignore it and go about my day, but the paranoia had settled deep into my bones, making me check over my shoulder everywhere I went. When I checked the app again later that afternoon, my worst fears were confirmed. The account had uploaded a new post. It was a picture of me from that very morning, taken from across the street as I was leaving the coffee shop with my drink. There was no caption this time, just the silent, undeniable proof that I was being watched. I reported the account again for harassment and texted a friend about the situation. But they just brushed it off, telling me that weird scam accounts were a dime a dozen. The following morning, I remember waking up with this heavy feeling in my gut, a sense of dread that made me hesitate to even look at my phone. When I finally did, I saw the notification I had been expecting. The duplicate account had tagged me in a new post. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely hold my phone as I clicked on the notification, my heart pounding in my ears. The photo was dark and grainy, but the location was unmistakable. It was a picture of my living room, taken from the corner of the room, pointed directly at the couch where I had been sitting just hours earlier. Panic surged through me like an electric current, my entire body going cold with the horrifying realization that someone had been inside the house. I scrambled out of bed and frantically rushed to check all the doors and windows, but every single lock was secure. Nothing in the house was missing, and nothing was out of place, which was somehow even more terrifying. Someone had gotten in, taken that picture as a message, and then left without a trace. I checked the timestamp on the post, and my blood ran cold. It had been uploaded just 2 hours before I woke up, which meant that whoever took it had been inside the house while I was asleep in my bed upstairs. I knew I couldn't stay in that house for another second. I threw some clothes into a bag, grabbed my laptop and my keys, and left without any kind of plan, my only instinct being to get as far away as possible. I ended up sitting in my car in a nearly empty grocery store parking lot, my hands shaking as I pulled up the Instagram profile one more time. And then a new post appeared right before my eyes. It was a picture of my car, sitting in that very parking lot, taken from somewhere nearby just seconds ago. I stared at the photo on my screen, my pulse hammering in my throat, as my eyes darted around the lot, desperately searching for whoever was watching me. I saw a few other cars scattered around, but nobody seemed to be paying any attention to me. I knew they were there, though, hiding somewhere in plain sight. I wasn't safe anywhere. I immediately started my engine and peeled out of the lot, driving aimlessly while constantly checking my rearview mirror for any sign of a tail. After 20 minutes of erratic driving, I pulled into a well-lit gas station and parked right by the entrance. I checked the Instagram account again, and this time the entire profile had disappeared. The page simply said, "User not found," with no trace of it ever having existed. That night in a cheap motel was probably the longest of my life, and I knew I couldn't handle it alone anymore. The next morning, I walked into a police station with the screenshots I had saved, expecting to be dismissed as just another online harassment case. But when I showed the officer the photo taken from inside my living room, his entire demeanor changed. He asked if I had noticed anything strange around the house before all this started. At first I told him no, but then the memory of the backyard gate came flooding back, and I mentioned it. The police did a thorough walkthrough of the house and found no signs of forced entry on the doors. But they did find a tiny piece of black electrical tape wedged in the frame of a downstairs window, holding the latch open just enough to prevent it from locking properly. Someone had been planning this for a while, and had probably been inside the house more than once. Leaving that house for the last time was a strange feeling of both relief and profound violation. I called my brother and told him everything, and then I packed my things and flew back to the States within the week, moving in with a relative while I tried to figure out what to do next. The police never found out who was behind the account, and the case just went cold. Another weird story in a file somewhere. A few months later, after I'd started to feel something resembling normal again, morbid curiosity got the better of me. I checked my old Instagram posts and noticed a new like on one of them from a completely blank account with no name or posts. My chest tightened as I clicked on the profile and saw that it was only following a single person. And that person was me. There's a rhythm to running that I used to find therapeutic, a kind of peace in the steady beat of your feet on the trail that nothing else could ever give me. It was a way to disconnect from the noise of my life. The endless emails, the demanding boss who lived on a different time zone, the low-grade hum of anxiety that came with living alone in a busy city. My entire workday was spent in a cubicle under fluorescent lights, staring at a screen, and those morning runs were the only time I felt truly untethered and alive. For years, my sanctuary was Washington Park in Portland, a sprawling patch of green that felt a world away from the concrete and glass. I started hitting those trails back in 2022, mostly as a way to get my health in order after my doctor gave me a look about my blood pressure. But it evolved into a ritual, a personal church I attended every morning at dawn. I knew every twist and turn of those paths, the specific smell of the damp earth and pine needles after it rained, the way the morning light would filter through the towering Douglas firs, painting the ground in shifting patterns. Looking back on it now, I think I took that feeling of safety for granted. The quiet assumption that I was just another anonymous jogger disappearing into the trees. I never realized that the very routine that brought me comfort was also making me predictable, and that my safe space was just a place that hadn't been violated yet. A week or two before it happened, I remember mindlessly scrolling through TikTok late one night, my thumb flicking past an endless stream of meaningless content. I eventually landed on one of those true crime conspiracy videos, the kind with a robotic text-to-speech voice narrating over grainy stock footage of empty forests and running paths. The creator was talking about a string of strange disappearances involving runners in parks across the country, stitching together cases that seemed unrelated on the surface, but shared a chilling pattern. It was always a lone runner on a routine path, a sudden feeling of being watched. And then they were just gone, vanished between one step and the next. The video mentioned a specific case from Iowa back in 2019, a college student who disappeared mid-run, and an endless scroll of people sharing their own creepy encounters. I remember one specific comment from someone claiming their cousin in Colorado had seen something similar, saying, "He said it didn't run, it just slid towards him." Another user had replied with a story about a hiker in Utah whose GPS tracker showed him moving at 30 miles per hour through dense woods before it stopped completely. I remember scoffing and rolling my eyes before swiping on, dismissing it all as internet fear-mongering designed to get clicks. It's always easy to write that kind of stuff off when it feels like it's happening to someone else, a million miles away. The morning it all went down was a perfect October day. The kind of crisp autumn weather where the air feels so clean and cold, it almost hurts to breathe in a good way. I started my usual 4-mile loop near the east entrance, feeling strong as I settled into my pace, my mind clearing with every stride. For the first couple of miles, it was perfect, just me and the trail and the quiet woods. The familiar sense of peace settled over me as I moved deeper into the park, the city noise fading away until all I could hear was my own breathing and the crunch of my brooks on the packed earth. It was around the 2-mile mark, just as I was heading into a more densely wooded section past the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, that I first felt that little prickle on the back of my neck. The ancient, instinctual warning that tells you a pair of eyes is on you. I glanced over my shoulder and saw a man behind me, maybe 50 yards back. A dark shape against the morning light. There was nothing immediately strange about that. But what was odd was that he just stayed there. A steady, constant presence that wasn't trying to pass and wasn't falling behind. I tried to ignore it at first, telling myself that I was just being paranoid, that my brain was still half asleep. I focused on my breathing, on the burn in my legs, on anything to push the thought away. But after another quarter mile, the feeling hadn't gone away, and it felt less like a coincidence and more like I was being deliberately echoed, my movements mirrored by an unseen partner. My internal monologue was a frantic debate between logic and instinct. Logic told me he was just another runner with a similar pace, and that I was the one being weird by overthinking it. Instinct, however, was screaming at me that I was prey, that something was fundamentally wrong with the situation. I decided to test the theory, a cold knot of dread starting to form in my stomach. I deliberately slowed my pace, letting my stride get a little heavier and more labored. Behind me, the cadence of the present slowed in perfect time with mine, a subtle shift that sent a chill through my entire body. So I pushed off again, my heart starting to beat a little faster as I picked up my pace to a near sprint, my legs pumping hard. He sped up too without any hesitation, the distance between us remaining stubbornly and unnervingly the same. That was when the flimsy excuse of coincidence completely evaporated into the cold morning air, leaving behind something raw and sharp. The park suddenly felt a lot bigger and somehow much more empty, the familiar trees now seeming to press in on me. When I got to the turnoff for the Hoyt Arboretum, I made a snap decision and veered onto a smaller, less traveled side trail, hoping to shake him, praying it was all in my head. As I made the turn, I risked another quick look back, and my heart sank into my stomach. He was right there behind me, turning onto the same path, without a moment's hesitation. That was the final confirmation I needed, the moment the switch in my head flipped from "this is weird" to "this is incredibly wrong." The memory of that stupid TikTok video flashed vividly in my mind, and all the little checkboxes were getting ticked off one by one. The air itself seemed to change right then, losing its crispness and growing heavy and stagnant around me. The usual forest sounds of scuttling squirrels and rustling leaves just seemed to die, replaced by an oppressive silence, broken only by my own ragged breathing and the rhythmic presence that shadowed me. I wasn't running for my health anymore. I was running to see if he would stop following me, and it was terrifyingly clear that he wouldn't. I hit the 3-mile mark with my lungs starting to burn, and when I glanced over my shoulder, I saw with a jolt that he had closed the distance significantly. He was close enough now that I could see the details, and what I saw made my blood run completely cold. There was something fundamentally broken about the way he ran. His torso held completely ramrod straight, while his arms barely moved at all, just hanging loosely at his sides as if they were useless appendages. His clothes didn't seem to ripple with the wind or his movement, almost like they were part of his skin. All the motion was isolated in his legs, which churned with a horrifyingly smooth, mechanical precision, like a marionette being dragged forward by invisible strings. Then I focused on the sound I was hearing, the one I had mistaken for a fellow runner's pace, and a new wave of absolute terror washed over my entire body. There was no crunch of his shoes on the trail, no puffing sound of his breath. The rhythmic sound I'd been hearing wasn't footsteps at all, but was instead a soft, wet, slapping noise, a sound that didn't belong in the quiet woods. Pure panic took over as I threw everything I had into a desperate sprint, my form going to shit as my legs moved forward on sheer, potent adrenaline. The path suddenly dipped into a steep downhill section, and I let gravity take me down the slope, half falling and half sprinting as I fought to stay upright, the metallic taste of fear flooding my mouth. I kept telling myself not to look back again, that it didn't matter what was behind me, only what was in front. But I just couldn't help myself, because I absolutely had to know. I stole one last terrifying glance over my shoulder and saw him moving at the same impossible speed. His body held completely rigid as his legs glided over the uneven terrain, without a single stutter or stumble. His movements were a complete contradiction to the known laws of physics. The main road was maybe half a mile away, but that distance now felt like an eternity. To my left, I saw a small, barely visible shortcut, an overgrown deer trail I'd always avoided because it looked like a good way to twist an ankle. Without even a moment of hesitation, I plunged directly into the brush, the damp smell of decaying leaves filling my nostrils as branches whipped at my face and arms and thorns tore at my leggings. The ground was slick and treacherous, but I didn't care about that at all. I just kept pumping my legs as hard as I could, my eyes locked on the sliver of light ahead. And then I heard a sound that almost made my heart stop dead in my chest. It was a sharp, wet breath right behind my ear. It was so close, I could feel the unnaturally cold dampness of it on my skin. And I just lunged forward with every last ounce of energy I had into a final, desperate sprint. The trees suddenly parted ahead of me, and I burst out of the woods and into the beautiful asphalt of the parking lot. My car was right there waiting for me, looking like the safest place on the entire earth. I fumbled with my running belt, my fingers shaking so badly I could barely get my keys, and threw myself into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut and mashing the lock button over and over. For a long minute, I just sat there, my whole body trembling uncontrollably. The only sound my own heaving breaths and the frantic thump of my heart. The windows began to fog up from my breathing as the adrenaline crash washed over me, leaving me feeling cold and hollow. When I could finally force myself to look up, I scanned the edge of the trail where I'd just come from, my eyes darting between the shadows of the trees, expecting to see him step out into the open. But there was absolutely nothing there to be seen. There was no man, and there was no creature. Just the quiet, still trees of the park, looking as peaceful and innocent as they did every other morning. I stayed inside my locked car for what must have been 20 minutes, just staring into the woods and catching my breath, before my trembling hands were finally able to turn the key in the ignition and get the hell out of there. Later that day, after I'd showered and tried to calm my shredded nerves, I was still replaying it all inside my head, trying to find a rational explanation. As I was putting my running shoes by the door to dry, I noticed the mud caked on the soles. And that is when I saw it. On the back of my left shoe, just above the heel, were the clear, unmistakable impressions of 4 fingers and a thumb, pressed into the mud in a grasping motion. The lines were trailing upward as if something had tried to grab my ankle from behind. I hadn't fallen on the trail, nor had I even stumbled in that specific way. The handprint was all the proof that I needed. The creepy thing running after me wasn't just in my head. It was terrifyingly real, and it had almost caught me. Still buzzing with a sick feeling, I opened my running app on my phone, my thumb hesitating over the screen, terrified of what I might find. My heart rate data was a complete mess, showing a huge, jagged spike right where the chase began and confirming my terror. But that wasn't even the weirdest part. On the GPS map of my route, there was a second line, a ghosted track that ran perfectly parallel to mine for the last half mile, appearing out of nowhere in the middle of the trail and then vanishing at the edge of the parking lot. It was a digital footprint of the thing that had hunted me through the woods, the exact kind of anomaly that TikTok video had warned about. My safe space is now forever gone, replaced by the memory of a wet, slapping sound where footsteps should have been, and a shape that moved in all the wrong ways. Out here on the plains of Kansas, you learn the difference between quiet and silence. Quiet is the sound of a good day, the wind rustling through the corn, the distant hum of your own tractor, the lowing of cattle. But silence is something else entirely, something heavier, more absolute. It's the feeling you get right before a storm rolls in, or in the dead of winter when the snow has buried everything, and the whole world seems to hold its breath. My family has owned this land for 3 generations, and I've spent my whole life learning its rhythms and its moods. I thought I knew every secret this flat, endless expanse of earth had to offer. But I've come to understand that some things about this place will never be known. The work is hard, but it's honest. A predictable cycle of planting and harvesting that's been drilled into me since I was a kid. Our farmhouse is old, built by my grandfather with his own 2 hands, and it carries the weight of all our years. The nearest neighbor is over a mile down a dirt road. So at night, the darkness out here is a profound, living thing, broken only by the moon and a blanket of stars that feels close enough to touch. It was late September of 2022, as I recall. The fields had finally gone quiet again. The frantic energy of the harvest was over, and a kind of heavy stillness had settled over the land as I began the solitary work of tilling the earth for the winter. It was just me and the tractor from sunup to sundown, turning over the tired earth acre by acre. I remember that evening specifically because the sunset was one of those impossibly beautiful ones, washing the whole sky in these deep shades of orange and purple that made the fields look like they were on fire. I finished up later than I intended and was walking the perimeter of the far field to check the fencing, a habit my dad drilled into me years ago before he passed. The air was still and warm from the day's sun. That's when I first saw it. It was just a small, dark shape in the distance. A vertical line of black standing right where my property meets the horizon. At first, my tired mind barely registered it, assuming it was a deer or a coyote. But it wasn't moving like any animal I'd ever seen. It was too smooth, too upright, and it seemed to glide more than it walked across the field's edge before disappearing behind a swell in the land. I shook my head, blaming my mind for playing tricks on me. The land does that out here when you're tired. The way light bends at dusk can make you see things that aren't there. Later on that night, I was trying to unwind in my dad's old armchair with a beer, the local news just flickering quietly in the corner of the room. I wasn't really paying attention until a certain story began, and I felt that familiar stillness in the house begin to slowly curdle into something else. The reporter spoke in a somber tone over grainy cell phone footage of a worried farmer gesturing at an empty pen. The story was the same every time. Farmers were waking up to find sheep and cattle gone without a trace. There were no broken fences, no blood, no tracks of any kind, just a strange and unsettling emptiness where there should have been life. The report jogged a memory, a story my dad told me when I was a teenager. I remembered him coming in from the fields one evening, looking pale and shaken, something I'd rarely seen. He'd lost a half-dozen cattle in a single night from that same far field. He always told the neighbors it was rustlers to save face and seem in control. But he once admitted to me that he never found so much as a single hoof print or a cut wire. The only thing he ever found that was out of place was a strange, dark scorch mark on a wooden fence post right near the empty pasture. He said it smelled faintly of burnt metal like a lightning strike, even though there hadn't been a storm for weeks. The memory was deeply unsettling. But I pushed it aside, telling myself it was just a coincidence from a bygone time. I had a restless night. The kind of sleep where you keep waking up for no reason. The silence of the house feeling loud and intrusive. The next day's work on the tractor felt different. The familiar roar of the engine seemed to be fighting against a quiet that was heavier than usual, and I found myself constantly scanning the long, empty horizon line, searching for a shape that I kept telling myself wasn't real. The hours dragged on, each pass across the field feeling more isolating than the last. By the time dusk began to settle, a growing sense of unease had been gnawing at me all day. The air was colder than the night before, and a thin, hazy fog was starting to roll in, clinging to the freshly tilled soil and obscuring the farthest edges of my property. I started my walk around the perimeter, the familiar routine feeling less like a habit and more like a necessary patrol. Halfway through my walk, I stopped dead in my tracks. The wind had died down completely, leaving the world in that heavy, unnatural silence from the night before. I turned toward the far field, and that's when I saw it again. The shadow was standing at the edge of the fog, much closer than before. It was a tall, impossibly thin, human-like figure, standing perfectly still and just watching. Then it took a step toward me, a movement so unnaturally smooth and fast that it didn't seem to obey the laws of physics at all. A jolt of pure, primal fear shot through my entire body, and I turned and bolted toward the house without a second thought. My heavy work boots pounded against the dirt, my breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps in the cold air. I could hear something behind me, not the sound of footsteps, but a soft, continuous shushing sound, like something was gliding just above the surface of the ground, tearing through the low-lying fog. My pulse was slamming in my ears, a frantic drumbeat against the silence, but I couldn't stop myself from risking a quick glance over my shoulder. The figure was running straight at me, gaining on me with an impossible, terrifying speed. Its body didn't bob up and down like a person running. It just moved forward in a single, fluid motion, as if it were being pulled along on a string, its limbs too long and its silhouette all wrong. My foot caught on a loose patch of dirt and I stumbled, hitting the ground hard and feeling a sharp, searing pain shoot through my knee. For a split second, I was sure it was over, that I would feel its weight on me. But I pushed myself up, my lungs burning, and ran harder than I ever have in my life. The warm glow of the porch light ahead, my only goal. I threw myself up the steps, my hand grabbing the railing to keep from collapsing, and I slammed the heavy wooden door shut, fumbling with the deadbolt with numb, shaking fingers. I grabbed my pump-action shotgun from beside the door, the cold steel a small comfort, and stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the door to splinter inward, but nothing came. Sleep never really came that night, as I just sat there in the dark with the shotgun across my lap, watching the windows until the first gray light of morning started to creep over the horizon. I didn't want to go back outside, every bone in my body screaming at me to stay put. But I knew I had to go and check that field. I walked the path of my frantic retreat, expecting to find something, anything, to prove I hadn't lost my mind. But there were no tracks in the soft, tilled soil, not from the figure and not even my own from where I had fallen. It was as if nothing had disturbed the ground at all, a fact that was almost as scary as the chase itself. I was about to turn back toward the house, my mind reeling with a confusing mix of relief and self-doubt, when I decided to walk the fence line one last time. And that's when I found it. Right where the figure had disappeared into the fog, there was a single, dark scorch mark on a wooden fence post, identical to the one my dad had described from all those years ago. As I leaned in closer, I could smell the faint, distinct scent of burnt metal and ozone hanging in the still morning air. I never saw the shadow again after that night. But I know it's still out there. Because some things don't need to leave tracks to let you know they've been on your land for a very, very long time. There's a certain kind of hollowness to a memory like this, a quiet dread that steeps into every detail when you look back on it. I think about shopping malls differently now. Back in 1993, they were just these massive, self-contained worlds of noise and people. Places you could disappear into for a few hours without a second thought. I'd lived in Philadelphia my whole life, and for me, the King of Prussia Mall was just a place you went when you needed something. It was one of the largest in the country back then, a sprawling labyrinth of stores that had everything you could imagine. I never went there for the fun of it, but it was efficient. And at 21, I was a creature of habit, finding a strange comfort in the predictable. I was working a thankless job as an assistant manager at a bookstore downtown, which meant my wardrobe consisted of comfortable jeans and whatever button-up shirt was clean. With a friend's wedding coming up that summer, I realized I needed to find something that didn't make me look like I was about to go shelving books. A need that feels so trivial now, considering what happened. It was a Wednesday afternoon in early September when I finally made the trip, a day I've replayed in my mind more times than I can count. I figured it would be less crowded on a weekday, a thought that now seems laughably naive. I drove up to King of Prussia and stepped inside. The familiar blast of air conditioning and the mall's distinct smell of new clothes and department store perfume washing over me. I wandered through a few stores before heading into one of the big anchor department stores, a place I thought I knew inside and out. I grabbed a couple of pairs of jeans and a few tops and made my way to the fitting rooms in the back corner. Thinking back on it now, I remember noticing how the layout was a little strange, a long, quiet hallway with mirrored doors on either side. At the very end of the hall, there was a small, unmarked door that I'd always assumed was for maintenance or storage. Just another forgotten detail in a place full of them. An employee at the entrance handed me one of those little numbered plastic tags, and I walked down the quiet, carpeted hallway. I picked a stall somewhere in the middle of the row, not wanting to be too close to the entrance, but not wanting to be isolated at the dead end either. I shut the heavy mirrored door, the lock clicking into place with a sound that used to feel secure. That's when I first heard it. The stall directly next to mine was closed, but there was no sound of movement from inside, no rustling fabric or clinking hangers. Instead, all I could hear was someone whistling, a faint, almost absent-minded tune that was instantly recognizable. It was the theme from the X-Files. The show had only premiered that month, but it was already a cultural phenomenon, and that eerie, haunting theme music was unforgettable. It wasn't a tune you'd expect to hear someone casually whistling, and what made a knot of ice form in my stomach was the voice itself. It was a deep, rough whistle, unmistakably a man's, and I was standing in the middle of the women's dressing room. A small, irrational jolt went through me as I crouched down to glance at the gap under the stall divider, seeing nothing on the other side but empty floor. I quickly straightened up, my heart starting to beat a little faster as I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was overthinking it. But I hadn't heard the door to his stall open or close. I tried to ignore the growing unease and started to try on the first pair of jeans. As I turned to check the fit in the full-length mirror on the door, something in the reflection made my entire body go rigid. Through the tiny, almost imperceptible gap between the mirrored door and its frame, I could see a sliver of a face. Someone was standing just outside my stall, peering in at me. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the reflection, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. It was just a fragment, a single dark eye, part of a cheekbone, but it was undeniably there. The whistling from the next stall had stopped completely, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating silence that seemed to press in on me from all sides. I turned my head just slightly, keeping my gaze locked on the mirror, confirming that whoever was out there wasn't moving at all. They were just standing there in the hallway, perfectly still, watching me through that tiny crack. A slow, creeping chill worked its way up my spine as I realized how deeply wrong this was. My instincts were screaming at me to get out. But I was frozen, trapped by the knowledge that if I threw open the door, he would be right there waiting. Instead, my heart hammering against my ribs, I knelt down again for another look under the door. This time, I saw them. A pair of dark, scuffed leather men's shoes were planted on the floor, facing directly toward my stall. A cold rush of pure fear flooded my veins. A man was in the women's dressing room, and he was standing right outside my door. I shot up so fast that my head nearly smacked the mirror, my hands slick and clammy as I fumbled to pull my own clothes back on. Then I saw the shoes in the gap under the door move, taking a slow, deliberate shuffling step closer. He wasn't leaving. He was repositioning himself. My chest tightened until it felt like a band of steel was wrapped around my lungs. The only sound in the entire fitting room was the frantic, panicked beat of my own heart. Then, the wall of the stall next to mine creaked loudly. Not the door, but the thin dividing panel itself. I realized what was happening a second too late. The narrow gap between the panels of the stall was widening as the man pushed on the divider from his side, forcing it open just enough to get a better look inside my stall. A low, raspy breath that was not my own wheezed through the newly formed gap. I acted on pure, unthinking adrenaline. I yanked my door open and stumbled out into the hallway, my hands shaking so badly that I could barely grab my bag from the floor. I risked a split-second glance back at the stall he had been in, expecting to see him stepping out after me. But the door to his stall was now wide open, and the inside was completely empty. My head spun with confusion and terror. I knew what I'd seen, and I knew what I had heard. I rushed past the entrance counter, barely registering the confused look the employee gave me as I practically sprinted out of the department store. I made it to the main escalators, my pulse pounding so hard that I thought I might actually pass out. As I stepped onto the moving stairs to go down, I turned back for one last look. And that's when I saw him. A man was standing near the dressing room entrance, wearing dark shoes and dark pants, his face just obscured enough by the glare of the overhead lights. He wasn't looking at clothes, and he wasn't holding any shopping bags. He was staring right at me. I whipped my head forward, gripping the escalator railing with stiff, sweaty fingers as a horrifying thought solidified in my mind. He had never left the dressing room area, which meant he had to have gotten out of that stall another way. And the only other way out was that small, unmarked maintenance door at the end of the hall. I didn't stop moving until I was outside in the crisp September air, but it did nothing to cool the burning panic in my chest. I hurried toward the parking lot, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. I reached my car and threw myself inside, locking the doors and starting the engine with trembling hands. I looked up, scanning the rows of parked cars, everything looking terrifyingly normal. Then I saw him again. He wasn't close, but he was standing at the far end of the lot, right near the exit, with his hands casually in his pockets. He was facing my car, just watching me. I slammed the car into reverse and peeled out of that parking lot without a second thought. By the time I merged onto the highway, I was sure I wasn't being followed. But that offered me no comfort. He had let me see him, and he wanted me to know that he knew which car was mine. That night, I locked every door and window in my apartment. But a week later, I found a shopping bag from that same department store sitting on my doorstep. My entire body went cold as I opened it and found the pair of jeans I had tried on in the dressing room, the same ones I had left behind when I ran. I never went to the police about the jeans because I was too scared to connect myself to him in any way. I threw them in a dumpster miles from my apartment and spent years trying to convince myself that it was just a random, terrifying encounter that had no deeper meaning. To this day, I still can't logically explain how he disappeared from that stall so fast or how he found my home with such ease. Sometimes, when I let my mind wander too far into that memory, I wonder if he was even a man at all, or just something else that was simply wearing the shape of one. For most of my life, I never considered myself a paranoid person, not by a long shot. Living alone was just a fact of my life, something I had grown accustomed to over the years without any real issue. After I moved back into my childhood home in Detroit back in 2014, I quickly found a comfortable rhythm for myself. My days were a simple loop of work, grocery runs, and late-night streaming sessions, with the occasional takeout order when I was too exhausted to even think about cooking. I just wasn't the type of person who scared easily. And while the city itself was always loud and busy, my house had always been my quiet corner of the world. That sense of security remained unshaken for a long time, right up until the night that everything changed for good. My career was as a fitness instructor, a path I had sort of fallen into after years of playing sports and eventually turning that passion for movement into a sustainable living. I taught strength training and injury prevention classes at a gym in Midtown, which meant early hours and a physically demanding workload. But I genuinely loved it. Thinking back on it now, it feels like the house always had a certain stillness to it. It had belonged to my adoptive parents, the only real family I had ever known since they took me in as a baby. They were hardworking, quiet people who had saved for years to buy the modest 2-bedroom home in an older part of the city. When they passed away, my dad first and then my mom a few years later, they left the house to me. A final, silent gift. I had considered selling it, moving into a newer apartment. But in the end, something held me back. I just couldn't bring myself to do it. The place was familiar, steeped in memories, so I stayed. The house had its quirks, of course, being built back in the 1960s. It came with its own symphony of sounds. The knocking pipes, the groaning heating system. Familiar sounds. I was used to all of it. It was my home, a place I thought I knew inside and out. The strange noises started sometime in February. At first, they were small and easy to dismiss. Just a soft shuffle here or a random creak in the floorboards there. Sometimes I would hear a faint brushing sound in the middle of the night, but I always chalked it up to the house settling or the wind rattling a loose screen. I never gave it a second thought. just another quirk of an old house. Then, one night, I woke up to something completely different. It was a low, steady vibration coming from my nightstand. Groggy from sleep, I reached over for my phone, assuming it was a late-night call from a friend. But when I looked at the screen, there was no incoming call and no new notification from any of my apps. There was just a single, unread text message waiting for me, from an unknown number I didn't recognize. My blood went cold as I read the 2 short sentences. "I can hear you breathing." I sat bolt upright in bed, my chest tightening into a painful knot. My first rational thought was that it had to be some kind of cruel prank or wrong number. But a cold ripple of fear was already spreading through me, because something about it felt deeply, horribly personal. I was completely alone in the house, and even if someone had my number, the timing and the message itself were terrifying. I locked my phone and set it face down on the nightstand, my pulse quickening as I strained my ears to listen for any unusual sounds. The house was dead silent, a heavy and unnerving stillness that felt different from its usual quiet. Just as I was about to convince myself that I was overreacting, I heard it again. It was a soft, deliberate rustling sound, and it was coming from directly beneath my bed. Every single muscle in my body locked in place as I held my breath, my mind struggling to process the sound. It wasn't the house settling this time, and it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside my bedroom. I didn't dare to move a muscle, my eyes glued to the edge of my bed where the comforter draped slightly over the floor. Then I saw the fabric lift, ever so slightly. Just a small, subtle shift, as if someone underneath had moved their position. And then, just as quickly as it had happened, everything went completely still again. I stared at that spot on the floor, my brain scrambling for a logical explanation. Maybe I had kicked the blanket in my sleep, or maybe a stray animal had somehow found its way inside the house. But the rational part of me, the part that had been so quick to ignore the noises for weeks, knew with a sickening certainty that I was not alone in the room. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, to get out of the house as fast as I could. But I was paralyzed by the terrifying question of what would happen if I did. If I bolted for the door, would the thing under my bed follow me? With a trembling hand, I reached for my phone again and turned the screen back on, my eyes immediately drawn to the chilling message. "I can hear you breathing." My own breathing hitched in my throat, sharp and loud in the silent room. Very slowly and cautiously, I slid my legs off the side of the bed, making sure to plant my feet on the floor as far from the edge as possible. My heart was pounding so loudly that I was sure whoever was under there could hear it hammering against my ribs. I stood up and took a single step back, my eyes still locked on the bed, watching for any sign of movement. There was nothing. Then, against every rational thought in my head, I did something I will regret for the rest of my life. I lowered myself down, bending at the knees, just enough to try and get a glimpse into the darkness beneath the bed. And that's when I saw them. 2 wide, unblinking eyes were staring directly back at me from the shadow. For a split second that felt like an eternity. We were both frozen in that terrifying tableau. I couldn't move, and I couldn't breathe. The air in the room suddenly feeling thick and suffocating. The foul smell of damp, stale sweat hit me then, a smell that told me whoever was under there had been hiding for a long time. The silence was shattered by a sharp rustling sound and a quick, jerking motion as the figure under my bed lunged forward toward me. I stumbled backward, a strangled cry escaping my lips as I nearly tripped over my own feet. A pale, dirty hand shot out from under the mattress and grasped at the edge of the bed, trying to pull itself out into the open. The sheer, absolute terror of that moment sent my body into autopilot. My only thought was to run. I bolted for my bedroom door, my hands shaking so violently that I fumbled with the lock for a precious second. Behind me, I could hear a heavy, uneven scrambling sound as the person dragged their body out from under the bed, followed by a low, wheezing breath that sounded far too close for comfort. I finally wrenched the door open and sprinted down the hallway, the old wooden floors creaking loudly under my weight. I wasn't thinking about anything except getting out of that house. I yanked open the front door and ran out into the freezing February night, my bare feet hitting the icy pavement with a searing pain that I barely even registered. I sprinted across my lawn toward my neighbor's house, my voice breaking as I screamed for help at the top of my lungs. Within seconds, their porch light flicked on, and the Thompsons, my childhood neighbors, rushed outside to see what was happening. Mrs. Thompson immediately wrapped a thick blanket around my shivering shoulders, while Mr. Thompson grabbed a heavy flashlight and began scanning my yard. They ushered me inside their warm home and locked the door behind us, and for a brief moment, I felt like I was finally safe. When the police arrived, they searched every single inch of my house from top to bottom. They found clear signs of a forced entry on the back door, with scratches and small dents in the metal frame where someone had worked to pry the lock open. They also found a trail of muddy footprints leading from the back door all the way to my bedroom, confirming my story. Then, just as they were finishing their search, one of the officers called me over to my bedroom and shined his flashlight into the darkness under my bed. He reached in with a gloved hand and pulled out a small, tarnished knife. Staring at that small, ugly blade in the officer's hand, my entire perspective of the event shifted into something far more horrifying. That's when another officer asked me, almost casually, how long I'd been hearing the strange noises in the house. I told him that it had been for a few weeks, probably since the beginning of February. He nodded slowly with a grim expression on his face, and in that instant, all the pieces clicked together in my mind in the worst possible way. The stale, lived-in smell from under the bed wasn't from a few hours of hiding. The weeks of small, dismissible sounds that I had blamed on the old house, the shuffles in the walls, the creaks from the attic, the soft, brushing noises in the dead of night. It was all him. My blood ran cold as I was hit with a realization that was somehow even more terrifying than the man with the knife. He hadn't just broken in that night to hide under my bed for a few hours. He had been living in my house for weeks, moving through the crawl spaces and forgotten corners of my parents' home like a parasite. The text message wasn't a threat from a new intruder, but a taunt from a roommate I never knew I had. I never spent another night in that house, and I sold it without ever stepping foot back inside. The man was never found. But the true horror I carry with me is not just the memory of his eyes in the dark, but the chilling knowledge that for weeks on end, I had never, ever been truly alone in my own home. That's all I have for y'all now, and that's the last story I have for you this evening. My voice will be gone in a moment, and you'll be alone with the sound of the rain. Try to let it soothe you, and try to get some rest. Just be sure your doors are locked. Until next time,